today, on this Tuesday, February the 13th, we are on our last day of the week before yet another reset in patch 10.2.5. So what we are doing, of course, is our weekly recap of the situation in Mythic Plus. What is unique going around this week isn't some random balance tuning coming out or some major changes to the specs. It is rather the end of the time trials for the MDI Mythic Plus tournament that has been going on last week. We have gotten the finished results of the 16 teams qualifying for the tournament. What was relevant, of course, was checking out what these groups were running in these plus 23 keys of Everbloom and Rise, in trying to do them as fast as possible. Because, as we have pointed out before multiple times, what the top players are doing often ends up trickling down to the more pleb part of the community. So what we were told at the very least, not super high keys, because that's the whole point of the MDI tournament, to do them as fast as possible, not to do the highest key you can, but rather do lower keys in the biggest amount of pools possible, like a ridiculous 10-minute Everbloom key, for example. Now, these are the results showing you pretty much the same idea from all groups. You run Fire Mage, Destro and Shadow Priest, and if you do need a healer, you run with Resto Druid. If you don't need a healer, then you add, most of the times, an extra Augmentation Evoker. The reason is simple, of course. Running such fast pools with many mobs is really beneficial if you have specs with much larger uncapped AoE, like a Priest and like a Destruction Warlock. And in the case you do need a healer, if you have to go for one, you go for Druid, because the healing required at this level is so low that Druid can spend most of its time in cat form and do higher DPS than any other healer, if they are allowed to spend that much time in cat form. That was the whole comp in this tournament. Now, you might be saying, well, but these keys are 23 level, right? Right now, the title earning keys in Mythic Plus are 29 keys. Even some 28 keys, definitely not 23. Well, you can, though, still see the effects of what the top players are doing in their own little world of the MDI by, for example, looking at this week's results of the DPS. When you look at the top damage, not the average, but rather the top damage, you will find some outliers. You know, here are the top damage, and then boom. Suddenly, the two top damages of the week are Shadow Priest and Destruction, at the highest overall damage in terms of top results, higher than anyone else. The third one is even Balanced Druid, which has also been used in higher and higher keys because of their problem, much like Shadow Priest, where they take more time to ramp up, they take more time to do damage in AoE, and lower level keys, like for example these 23 keys, don't allow you to have that much ramp on mobs, and more importantly, don't have nearly as much priority damage. The damage of a Balanced Druid is way more just flat, consistent AoE to all mobs. They lack the priority single target damage as they are AoEing, which is something that Shadow Priest does much better, and the reason why they were chosen to be in this tournament. And if you see a Druid, that's not even gonna be a Balanced Druid either, it's just gonna be a feral one. So you can see from the results that yes, there has been an impact on the general population from the results of the MDI by a much higher, first of all, performance of these two specs in the top results, and also the play rate, as it has increased over time by just going, for example, a month ago, for example, Shadow Priest and Destruction, they were not nearly as popular as before. Even the very high resulting Destro had one of the lowest participation in that week compared to this week, where they are more in line with many other specs, and also above pretty much all of the specs right here except for Augmentation. We have though continued a trend which started over a month ago after a series of buffs to Retribution Paladin, where Red Paladin over time started growing more and more in damage to the point where they started fighting for first place compared to Demon Hunter. One week they were first, then they were second, this week they are up again, this time by even more compared to Havoc Demon Hunter, and they have also at the same time, hand in hand together, continued to gap the rest of the DPS by quite a good margin, right? Consistently now for basically a month. That's been the results of the top DPS in this week and in this latter part of the season. Other specs have continued to do well, like Outlaw, like Demo, and like Fire Mage after their buffs, as well as Beast Mastery. Windwalker is another one of these specs that has been buffed about a month ago in their performance and has continued week over week to stay within the top, right? Not ever one of the like top 3 DPS specs, but they has continued to be, you know, one of the top, definitely clearly in the top 10, you know, fighting to get week in and week out in the top 5 almost of the results. Some other specs that were buffed at the same time as Windwalker. We have our tuning over here, you know, other specs like Unholy, DK, Frost DK, Feral Druid. You had, of course, Red Paladin being buffed, but then you also had Arms Warrior being buffed. Some of these specs did not have nearly the same amount of growth as Ret or Windwalker. Like, as mentioned, Feral Druid did not really grow nearly as much. Frost DK also did not really grow nearly as much as a buffed spec compared to Ret, compared to Windwalker, compared to Shadow Priest, which was also buffed, Destruction Warlock, which was buffed at the same time as Affliction. It definitely feels quite sad to be a spec that can't even out-damage Augmentation Evoker, a spec that isn't even supposed to be doing that much damage and you're still losing. That's definitely quite sad for a spec. We have now approached a level where even most of the other ranking sites are putting Ret now into the S tier, and they have sort of dethroned Augmentation. Now it's this trio that is doing very well, while also, of course, giving way more value to Destro and to Shadow Priest, even in a different type of ranking in terms of score. From 26 and higher keys, you see now randomly Destro and Shadow Priest growing out of nowhere. This, of course, is still not nearly as representative of the rest of the player base. As you can see here, you can barely even see Destro. From 3% of Demo to 2% of Destro. It's just barely showing up. However, you can see Shadow. Quite clear level of growth over the past couple of months, from basically being not even visible to now being a major part of the meta overall. It is actually at this point become quite a significant change from the start of the season, the first month of the season. You see Augmentation and you see Havoc. Now, a couple of months later, Havoc has lost 2/3 of its player base, and Augmentation has lost almost 2/3 of its player base. So, where did all of these players go? Well, the players went either to Fire, which has over than tripled its presence in keys, and is continuing to rise even more so. 6, 11, 14, 19, 20, 24, 24, right? And then Shadow, from 1% to 10% overall of a presence in high keys, and then Ret from 2% all the way to 14%. I would say this is overall quite good for the meta, because look at the amount of specs over 2 months ago. We had close to or above 10% presence in the meta. This was 1, this was 2, and this was, you know, almost 3, right? Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we went from 3 to 6. We have now doubled the amount of viable picks in high keys in the meta in slightly under a couple of months. So that is definitely an improvement when it comes to DPS. The improvement isn't nearly as much there when it comes to healers, because this was very even, you know, 26, 27, 29, 29, 26, 28. 30, 29, 31, 28, 30, 32. This was quite harmonious. Now, though, we have gotten a bit of a squish on the left side, where Discipline is being taken over more by Mistweaver. Now, this might also have something to do with the growth of Shadow, because right as Discipline lowers its presence, Shadow at the same time increases it. You know, 29 and 1, 21 and 10. It's almost like all of the loss of Discipline turned into a Shadow Priest in the same group. But still, though, the healers overall still remain quite varied, as you can see here from the rating of variety and options in the heal range. 500-ish is still a decent number of variety. It is still not as good, of course, as the first couple of months of choices of healers, but it's still in a healthy enough rating. If you keep scrolling down, 550 was still higher than most of the Season 2 meta, and more or less in line, still slightly below the first part of Season 1. So it's still in a good position. However, we cannot just ignore what's been happening over here. Because what's been happening over here is actually a severe dominance of Vengeance Demon Hunter, which has now approached a number similar to the dominance of Guardian Druid. 750 is actually quite on par with the level of Guardian during the Exodia meta. It has now skyrocketed up to above 80% over the past month and a half, a little bit over a month. They went from not even being 50% to now being well over 80, and prot padding losing more and more presence in the meta. Now, similar to Discipline and Shadow, there might have something to do with the growth of Ret from 46 and 4 to 15 and 14, not nearly as evenly split as Discipline and Shadow, but maybe it has something to do with moving the utility of a paladin in a key over to Ret, and therefore needing fewer prot paladins, or simply just by Vengeance being the stronger option and more tanks leaning on playing Vengeance in high-level keys. We do have, based on these results, our updated tier list to mourn the death of the sub-creation site that used to make this, and now it's gone because it has been eaten by Archon, much to the displeasure of many players. Now you can find somewhat similar back on Mythic stats with the rankings of the specs based on their performance, where you can also find some similar things you used to find on sub-creation, like the most used talent compositions of each of the builds, the most played builds in Mythic Plus keys. They are back, and you can find them still here. Quite a few of these things we have, however, seen for quite a while, like for example these top 3 gap in the rest has been a staple of this season. 1 and 2 have also been a staple of this season. A few more changes here and there in the DPS category, where Fire grew over time, Shadow Priest grew over time, Destruction got out of the bottom tier over time, Fury Warrior and Windwalker also grew over time. Those are some of the changes happening when it comes to the DPS in the meta of Mythic Plus. We can once again put this perspective on a timeline to make it even more clear of what's been going on in the meta of Mythic Plus, where when it comes to the range DPS, the one outlier is the growth of the buffed Fire Mage, which used to hang quite lower down in the middling to just unremarkable level of damage, and then over time it went further and further up. This is even more comically visible when we are talking about the Red Paladin, because, well, again, they were just a middling spec, and then all of a sudden they decided, no, I'm not a middling spec, I'm actually doing the top damage in Mythic Plus, and that's what they ended up doing right now. At the same time, though, if they go up, someone else has to suffer, and in this season, who has suffered, perhaps unjustly, is Assassination. Back at a time where they were only slightly ahead of Red, well, look at them now. Now they are being gapped by about 65% more damage is what a Red Paladin is doing to them in Mythic Plus at the moment, compared to a couple of months ago, those good old days where they were so close to each other. Somewhat similar has been happening to Tank, although Tank damage is not nearly as relevant. Again, the consistent dominance of Vengeance Demon Hunter, as they kept being the one chosen for the very high keys, also ends up doing the most damage overall as a result. Meanwhile, though, when talking about the performance of the specs, what has been changing, what might have affected the performance of these specs, like for example the presence of certain picks and choices in the MDI tournament for players to go and try to mimic in normal level keys. What we can also check is our situation with the dungeons and the popularity of the compositions and the picks in Mythic Plus. Our question, as we have had for the past couple of months, is whether or not Murzon's Rise would have moved out from being the hardest dungeon in the season, and for once, finally, we can say that yes, they have just barely passed Throne of the Tides as the no longer hardest dungeon of the season. Although they do continue to be, by quite a clear gap, the 2 hardest ones. They have continued to do so for the past few weeks, right? Even weeks ago, both of them, Rise and Throne, were still quite clearly gapping the others in terms of difficulty. So even after the nerfs to Rise, they might have inverted the position, but the gap from the rest is still quite visible in terms of difficulty of both dungeons, whether it is fortified or even if we go back to tyrannical days, they are still the 2 at the bottom, and they're still quite a few percentages lower down than the rest of the dungeons. The last part is, of course, when it comes to compositions, as we continue to see some of the outliers we have noticed by looking at the situation in the meta, in the results of the meta, where Fire Mage is now a present choice every time, followed by Ret, which has now taken up more and more space out of the other DPS. And also Vengeance has finally purged away Paladins. We wondered last week where Paladin was on life support in the tank position with just one left, and then a couple of weeks before that it was just 2 paladins left. From 2 we went to 1, and now from 1 we went to 0. So now it's just Vengeance. Discipline has been splitting time more and more with Resto and Mistweaver over time. If you go back over a month ago, Discipline was more prevalent over the other 2 healers. Now it's a more even split. It's in fact a 3 Mistweaver, 4 Resto Druid, 5 Discipline Priest split. This seems to be the main setup for groups at the moment in terms of amount of runs compared to all the other possible compositions. Vengeance, Fire, Ret. So you get your meta tank, your Bloodlust, and your Combatress. And then the rest you just pick. You just pick whatever. We have seen from the meta itself, you do have multiple options. You can choose amongst 3 different healers. We have mentioned you now have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 quite playable, even 7 with balance, quite playable different DPS to choose from. So you have a wide array of options to close out your group in popular Mythic Plus compositions. Obviously, to finish, it's always worth pointing out this is not representative of the title earning keys. If you looked at this, you would think Ret Paladin was the absolute dominating pick in high keys. That's just for the, the normal people high keys. The actually rank 1 level of keys don't have nearly as many Ret Paladins as you would think. In fact, they have like 1 and 2, and that's still the same guy. That's the amount of Ret Paladins that show up compared to other players, other picks. You don't see nearly as much in here. Like, for example, there is 1 Bonus Druid here, but then you look at here, and the Bonus Druids are way more than Ret Paladins, for example. You could be saying the same for something like Shadow Priest. We are even seeing more Rogues than something like Ret Paladins. So to finish, it's always worth mentioning there is a difference between the more popular keys at a high level overall, and then the absolutely highest level of keys, which work by a different meta, a different set of priorities compared to the more average level high keys, going from 27, 28, 29 even to 30 and 31. You do see quite some differences in the picks. That's all we have to check for today's recap of our Mythic Plus situation in patch 10.2.5. We still have no indication that any further changes or tuning are going to be coming, perhaps in our secret 10.2.6 that will come out in a few weeks, where we have been told we won't be given any info about it. Maybe we have some surprise changes in that patch, but for now this is what we have as far as the Mythic Plus situation on this reset day on NA and soon to be reset day in EU. So with this out of the way, we are now going to be leaving each other. We are starting, as usual, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help that you can give to the channel, either by liking the video or commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these pointless things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys, I think, tomorrow, and in the meantime, here it comes, the treacherous nose itching by the end of the video. Always there.